When a man turns 69 and goes under the knife for a risky heart valve replacement, he expects his only son to be in the waiting room. Mine was on a flight to Cabo. He picked a beach over my chest being cracked open, convinced I'd be fine alone. He was wrong. The ICU nurse who took my hand that night had a question about a woman I'd loved in 1979. That question cracked open 45 years of silence because the nurse beside me wasn't a stranger. She was my daughter. This is about Joseph, a 69-year-old retired firefighter who faced a valve replacement alone because his son, Mark, decided a Mexican vacation mattered more. But the nurse assigned to his ICU bed wasn't just any nurse. She had been searching for him for years. The night before his chest was opened, she asked about a woman named Patricia. That question began a countdown to a truth that would rewrite his entire existence. Joseph Donovan had spent 3 decades running into burning buildings while other people ran out. He had carried children down smoke-choked stairwells, held collapsing ceilings on his shoulders long enough for his crew to escape, and stared down flashovers that would make most men freeze. He had buried friends, attended their funerals, and stood at attention while bagpipes played. Through all of it, his body held. His heart, the one person he thought he could always count on, turned out to be the thing that would fail him. It started with shortness of breath on his morning walk, then dizziness bending down to tie his boots. At 69, retirement was supposed to be quiet, coffee on the porch, a garden, maybe teaching his teenage grandson how to fish. Instead, a cardiologist sat him down in a windowless office and explained that his aortic valve had calcified to the point of near blockage. The heart muscle was thickening dangerously, working harder than any fire ever made it work, and it was losing. Without surgery within 4 weeks, the risk of sudden death was not theoretical, it was statistical. Joseph listened, nodded, and asked only one question: how long is the recovery? They told him a few months with rehab, but the survival rate for his age group was strong if he had support at home. Support. He had Mark. Mark was his only child, 37 years old, married with 2 kids, living 4 miles away. He worked in medical sales, made good money, drove a car that cost more than Joseph's first house. They talked once a week, saw each other at holidays. Joseph called him the evening after the diagnosis and said, "I need you, son. This one's serious." Mark said, "Of course, Dad, I'll be there. I'll take time off." Joseph believed him because that's what fathers do. A man who trusts a partner in a burning building learns to trust his own blood. He should have known better. 7 days before the surgery, Mark called back. His voice had that upbeat, rushed energy he used when he was already mentally packing. "Dad, about your surgery. I've got this trip to Cabo with Jenna and the kids. We planned it 18 months ago. The kids are so excited. I can't pull them out now." Joseph stood in his kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, staring at the calendar on the fridge where he'd circled the operation date in red. He said, "Mark, they're cutting my chest open. This isn't a wisdom tooth." Mark insisted he'd be back before anything happened. The surgery was on a Tuesday. Mark's flight returned the following Friday. That was 3 days post-op. "You'll be out of the ICU by then, Dad. You're tough. You'll barely notice I'm gone." What could Joseph say? He said, "Fine, go." And Mark did. Joseph walked into Mercy General Hospital alone on a Monday afternoon with a small duffel bag and a folder of signed consent forms. The pre-op wing hummed with fluorescent light and antiseptic. A volunteer at the front desk asked if he had family coming. He shook his head. She offered him a cup of water. That was the deepest human connection he had that day. He changed into a pale blue gown, answered the same questions from 3 different nurses, and let a technician shave his chest. When the anesthesiologist came by to explain the risks, stroke, bleeding, infection, death, there was no one in the room to squeeze his hand. He signed the last form and thought, this is how a firefighter goes out. Not in a blaze of glory, but in a sterile room with a felt-tip pen and no witnesses. Then Sarah walked in. She was 45, with brown hair pulled back in a low bun, deep brown eyes that seemed to hold a question before she ever opened her mouth, and a name badge that read Sarah RN ICU. She was assigned to him for pre-op monitoring and post-op recovery. She checked his vitals, adjusted his IV, asked him the standard questions. But then she lingered, reading his chart with an intensity that felt different. She asked where he grew up. He told her Millbrook, a small town about 90 miles east. She paused. She asked if he'd always lived there. He said most of his life, except for a stint in the late 70s working at a textile plant in Belleville. Something flickered in her eyes. She set down his chart. And then, very quietly, she asked a question that had nothing to do with his heart valves. "Mr. Donovan," she said, "did you ever know a woman named Patricia Lawn around 1979? The name hit Joseph like a physical blow. Patricia, the woman who had disappeared overnight, leaving behind nothing but a note that said she couldn't stay. He never knew why, and he never spoke of her again. He stared at the nurse and felt the room tilt. How in the world did she know that name? Sarah's question hung in the air between them, heavier than the antiseptic smell of the ICU. Joseph stared at her, his mouth dry, the name Patricia Lawn echoing in his skull like a fire bell from a station he thought was permanently closed. He managed one word. How? It came out as a whisper, barely pushing past the lump in his throat. Sarah looked down at his chart, then back at him, and her professional composure cracked just enough to show something trembling underneath. She said, "Because Patricia was my mother." The heart monitor beside Joseph's bed spiked. A soft beeping sped into a flutter of electronic alarm, and Sarah reached over instinctively to silence it, but her eyes never left his. Joseph felt the room narrow to just the two of them. His chest, already tight from a failing valve, constricted further. He had loved Patricia deeply for 6 months in 1979, and then one morning she was gone. No explanation, no forwarding address. He had searched for her, asked around the plant, even filed a missing persons report that led nowhere. Eventually he had to accept that some people just walk away. He had no idea she was pregnant. He said it out loud. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Sarah nodded slowly. She believed him. She told him that Patricia had found out 2 weeks after leaving and had been terrified. She was 19, alone, convinced Joseph would hate her or feel trapped. So she ran again, this time to a different state, and built a life in the shadow of a secret she carried for 4 decades. Sarah grew up with no father listed on her birth certificate, just a blank line where a name should have been. When she asked, Patricia would shake her head and say, "Another time." There was never another time until the cancer came. 2 years ago, with weeks left to live, Patricia finally handed Sarah an old photograph and a piece of paper with a name and a last known town. "Joseph Donovan, Millbrook, find him, tell him I'm sorry." Then she was gone. Joseph's eyes were wet now, tears slipping down the weathered canyons of a face that hadn't cried since his last firefighter funeral. He asked if Patricia had been happy. Sarah paused, chose honesty, said she was a good mother, strong, but there was always a sadness in her eyes, especially on his birthdays. The admission broke something open in Joseph. He had spent 45 years burying that relationship, and now it was rising from the grave with a daughter he never knew existed. But there was a terrible, practical truth hanging over all of it. In 12 hours, Joseph was going into surgery where his chest would be sawed open and his heart stopped and repaired. The mortality rate for a man his age with his valve condition wasn't trivial. He could go under anesthesia and never wake up, and this miracle would become a footnote in a medical file. Sarah, still holding his chart, seemed to reach the same realization. She sat on the edge of his bed, a breach of protocol that neither of them cared about, and took his hand. She said, "I transferred to this hospital 6 months ago after I traced you here. I've been waiting for the right moment, but then I saw your surgery on the schedule and I couldn't wait any longer. I didn't want you to go through this alone." Alone. The word landed like a slap. Joseph thought of his son Mark, probably sipping a margarita by a pool right now, sending photos of turquoise water to their family group chat. A man who had everything Joseph had built for him, a childhood full of love, a paid-for education, a safety net that caught every fall, had left his father to face a knife without a single person in the waiting room. And here was Sarah, a woman who had been denied everything, showing up at the 11th hour to be the family he had always been missing. Joseph asked about her life. She told him she was married, had 2 kids, a boy and a girl, 14 and 11. She showed him a photo on her phone, a grinning boy with his arm around a girl with pigtails, his grandchildren. Joseph reached out and touched the screen with a trembling finger. He had missed every birthday, every school play, every scraped knee. But he was looking at them now, and he made a silent vow that if he survived, he would never miss another thing. But the ore wasn't going to wait. The surgical transport team appeared in the doorway with a gurney and a clipboard, and the moment shattered. Sarah stood, smoothed her scrubs, and became a nurse again. She promised him she would be in the operating room, not as his nurse officially, but as family, and that she would be the first face he saw when he woke up. He looked at her and said, "I just found you. I'm not ready to lose you." She squeezed his hand and said, "Then fight." He nodded, wiped his face, and let them transfer him. As the gurney rolled out of the ICU and down the long corridor toward the surgical suite, Sarah walked beside it, her hand on his shoulder, a daughter escorting her father into battle. The automatic doors swung open, the bright lights of the operating theater swallowed him, and the last thing Joseph Donovan heard before the anesthesia pulled him under was her voice, quiet and fierce, saying, "I'll be here, Dad." For 6 hours, Joseph Donovan lay on an operating table with his chest open and his heart stilled, while a team of surgeons performed a repair so delicate that a single tremor could end him. Sarah waited. She had no official role in the OR, but the surgical director, a man who had seen enough of life to recognize a family bond when it landed in his unit, let her stand just outside the sterile field, gowned and masked, watching through the glass. She did not move. She watched every incision, every suture, every time the perfusionist adjusted the bypass machine. She whispered prayers her mother had taught her, the ones Patricia whispered in the dark during the months of chemo, asking for more time. She asked for the same thing now. "More time, please, just more time." When the lead surgeon finally stepped back, pulled off his gloves, and nodded, Sarah's legs nearly gave out. The valve was in. The heart was beating on its own again, steady and strong, a rhythm that sounded to her like a promise. Joseph was wheeled into the cardiac ICU with a dozen wires and tubes trailing from his body, but alive, really alive. The kind of alive that meant the fight wasn't over, but victory was now possible. He woke 2 hours later, swimming up through the fog of anesthesia, his throat raw from the breathing tube. The first thing he registered was warmth on his hand. Someone was holding it. He turned his head, the motion costing him everything, and found Sarah's face. She had dark circles under her eyes, her bun was coming loose, and she was smiling through tears she hadn't bothered to wipe away. She squeezed his fingers. "I told you I'd be here," she said. His voice was a croak, barely audible. "Hi, sweetheart." The word came out before he could think about it, an instinct from a part of his brain that recognized something his waking mind was still learning. Sarah's composure, held together for hours by sheer will, shattered entirely. She pressed her forehead to the back of his hand and wept. The ICU nurses, who had heard the story by now through the hospital grapevine, found reasons to stay busy at the other end of the hall. Over the next 72 hours, Joseph learned two things. First, recovery from open-heart surgery felt like being trampled by a horse and then asked to walk up a flight of stairs. Second, he had a daughter who had been carrying his face in her memory since childhood. Sarah pulled a chair up to his bedside every day after her shift ended, sometimes before it started, and they talked. She told him about growing up in a small rental house in Ohio, about the way Patricia had worked double shifts at a diner to pay for dance lessons, about the year she got pneumonia and they almost lost the house. Joseph listened, his jaw tight, his eyes never leaving her face. He wanted to absorb every detail he'd missed, every school play, every broken bicycle chain, every moment a father should have been there. And then she told him something that cracked his chest wider than the surgeon saw ever could. Patricia, in her final month, had handed her two items. The photograph and the name, yes, but also a shoebox. Inside the shoebox was every newspaper clipping about Joseph Donovan that had ever appeared in the Millbrook Gazette. The Firefighter of the Year award in 1994. The picture of him carrying a child out of an apartment building in 2001. The article when he retired, with a quote from his captain calling him the bravest man he'd ever known. Patricia had clipped them all. She'd never stopped loving him, never stopped tracking his life from a distance. She was just too ashamed of leaving, too certain that her secret pregnancy would be met with rejection, too convinced she had ruined any chance she had. So she stayed silent, and she let her daughter grow up with an empty line on a birth certificate and a shoebox full of a man she'd never meet. Joseph held the shoebox, now delivered by Sarah's husband from her house, in his trembling hands while tears ran into the oxygen tube beneath his nose. He had spent his entire adult life saving strangers, strangers he would never see again, whose names he would never know. And the one person who needed him most, the one person whose life he could have changed simply by showing up, he had never been given the chance to save. That grief, layered on top of the surgical pain, was a weight he didn't know how to carry. But he wasn't carrying it alone. On day 4, a tablet appeared, and on its screen were two faces. Sarah's children, Lucas and Mia, calling from home. They had been told about their grandfather. Mia, the 11-year-old, held up a hand-drawn card that said, "Get well soon, Grandpa Joseph." He held it together for exactly 3 seconds, then sobbed so loudly that a passing nurse checked his heart monitor. Lucas, 14 and trying to be cool, said, "Mom says you're tough. She says you walked into fires. That's pretty metal, Grandpa." Joseph laughed and cried at the same time, which is an excruciating combination when your sternum has just been wired shut. But here is the thing about family wounds. They don't stay sealed forever. On Friday afternoon, one day earlier than planned because his resort's weather had turned and a hurricane was threatening the coast, Mark Donovan walked through the hospital doors. He had been texting his father daily with photos of sunsets and snorkeling trips. He had sent a single message asking how the surgery went and received a terse reply from an unknown number, Sarah, saying, "He's recovering, family is with him." Mark assumed it was a neighbor, a friend from the firehouse, someone. He did not expect to find a woman in scrubs laughing with his father, showing him photos on her phone like she belonged there. He stopped in the doorway. Sarah looked up. Joseph's face, open and warm seconds earlier, tightened. "Mark," he said, "you're back early." There was no relief in his voice, no joy. Just a factual statement, the kind you offer a coworker who returns from a break. Mark's eyes flicked between the two of them, landing on the tablet still displaying a family photo of Sarah, her husband, and the kids. "What is this?" he asked, his tone already defensive. "Who are you?" He aimed the question at Sarah like a weapon. Joseph answered before she could. "This is Sarah. She's your sister, my daughter." Mark blinked. His brain visibly stalled, trying to process words that did not compute. He said, "That's not possible. You don't have a daughter." Joseph's voice was quiet, level, the voice he had used to calm panicked victims in burning rooms, but now it carried an edge of iron. "She's been here every day, Mark, every hour. She held my hand when I went under. She held my hand when I woke up. She's the reason I'm still here. Where were you?" Mark's tan suddenly looked less like a healthy glow and more like a brand. He had the audacity to get angry. He called the revelation ridiculous, demanded paternity tests, accused Sarah of being a con artist preying on a vulnerable old man. Sarah did not flinch. She had been a nurse for 22 years, which meant she had dealt with men like Mark Donovan her entire career, men who confuse volume for authority and panic for principle. She simply pulled out her phone and showed him the results of a DNA test she had quietly run 3 months earlier, when she first traced Joseph to the hospital's patient registry. The probability of paternity was printed clearly in bold font, 99.999%. Mark's mouth opened and closed. The fight in him flickered. But instead of adjusting, instead of doing the hard thing and looking inward, he doubled down. He looked at his father, packed with tubes in a hospital bed, and said the worst thing he could possibly say. "I hope you're not planning to change anything. Mom would never have wanted strangers taking what's ours." Joseph Donovan, who had not raised his voice in anger in over a decade, did not raise it now. He simply looked at his son with the cold steadiness of a man who once watched a beam fall on the best friend he ever had and still finished the rescue. And he said, "Get out." Mark stood there stunned, his face a mask of entitlement and fear. Sarah quietly picked up the tablet, muted the call, and took her father's hand. Mark had a choice, retreat or escalate. He retreated, but the look he threw back over his shoulder promised that this was not finished. The silence after he left was heavy. Joseph turned to Sarah and said, "I have a will, I need to fix it. I want the house, the pension, everything I've built to go to you and those kids." Not because I hate Mark, but because a real family shows up. Sarah started to protest. She didn't need his money. He held up a hand. "I know you don't, but this isn't for you. It's for the 45 years I wasn't there. Let me do this, please." She nodded, too emotional to speak. Joseph picked up his phone, ignoring the soreness in his chest, and dialed his attorney. The game was about to change, and the man who had chosen a margarita over a father's life was about to discover exactly how much his absence had cost him. The attorney arrived at Mercy General the next morning, carrying a leather portfolio and the quiet efficiency of a man who has drafted wills for dying patriarchs and furious sons. Joseph was propped up in bed, still tethered to monitors, but his eyes were sharp. Sarah sat beside him, holding the tablet with Lucas and Mia on mute, their small faces watching a family being rebuilt in real time. The attorney laid out the old will on the bedside tray. It was a straightforward document: house, pension, savings, all to Mark, his only known child. Joseph looked at it the way you look at a building you're about to demolish. Then he dictated the new terms. The house would go to Sarah, fully and immediately upon his death. The pension would be split, half to Sarah, half to a college fund for Lucas and Mia. The savings account, accumulated over decades of double shifts and carefully managed overtime, would be placed in a trust for the grandchildren. Mark would receive the sum of $1, not as an insult, but as a statutory placeholder to prevent a legal challenge on grounds of omission. The attorney raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Joseph signed with a hand that still shook from the surgery, but his signature was as steady as it had ever been on a fire department incident report. Mark found out 3 weeks later when a certified letter arrived at his house. He called his father, and the conversation was brief. Joseph told him exactly what he'd done and exactly why. Mark threatened to sue, to contest, to drag the whole thing through probate court. Joseph asked him if he had any idea what his name had been before he was adopted. Mark went silent. Joseph told him he was adopted as an infant and he owed his entire life to a woman who chose him. But the fact of being chosen had apparently taught him that family was optional, that you could take the love and leave the duty. That wasn't the lesson Joseph had hoped he'd learn. Mark hung up. He didn't call again. For a man whose entire self-image had been built on being the sun around which his family revolved, this was an eclipse he couldn't face. Months passed. Joseph's chest healed, the wired sternum knitting itself into a permanent ridge beneath his skin. He moved slowly at first, then faster, with the gait of a man who had cheated a very large bullet. Sarah found him a small apartment 10 minutes from her house, close enough that he could walk to dinner, far enough that he maintained the independence he'd always prized. He learned the names of Lucas's baseball teammates. He taught Mia how to make his mother's meatloaf, the recipe card yellowed and stained, now copied in a child's handwriting on a fresh index card. He attended parent-teacher conferences and sat in folding chairs at school concerts, recording shaky videos on a phone his granddaughter had taught him to use. This was the life he'd missed. This was the life he was building. Then, one Saturday afternoon in October, Sarah came to his apartment with a small package wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine, the kind of wrapping that speaks of things long stored. Inside was a letter Patricia had written 6 months before she died, sealed in an envelope with Joseph's name on it, held back by Sarah until she was sure he was strong enough to read it. The letter was 4 pages long, in handwriting that still tilted the same way it had in the notes she used to leave on his pillow in 1979. She wrote about leaving, about the fear that had swallowed her, about watching him from afar for 45 years, too ashamed to walk back into his life, but too in love to stop looking. She wrote about the day she saw his name in the newspaper as Firefighter of the Year, and how she'd clipped it out and cried in her kitchen. She wrote about Sarah, about all the times she almost told her the truth, about the night she finally did, about the peace that came when Sarah promised to find him. She ended with 4 words, "I always loved you, please love her for me." Joseph folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope and pressed it to his lips. He looked at Sarah, who was crying silently in the armchair across from him. He said, "I do." She came and sat beside him on the couch, and they stayed there until the sun went down, 2 people who had found each other in the final quarter of a life, filling the silence with a presence that words couldn't match. The last time Joseph saw Mark was at a gas station, purely by chance, a year after the surgery. Mark was pumping fuel into the same expensive car, and he looked up and their eyes met. Mark's face cycled through surprise, then defensiveness, then something that might have been regret. He opened his mouth to speak. Joseph, who had just come from Lucas's championship game, still wearing a team cap, simply nodded and said, "Your sister says hello." Then he got back in his truck and drove to a home where the dinner table was set for 5. He had not stopped loving his son. He had simply learned that being a father is something you earn every day, and the people who do the earning are the ones who get to call you dad. Joseph Donovan spent his life running toward danger while others ran away. He didn't expect a parade. He didn't expect gratitude. But he did expect, somewhere deep in the part of him that still believed in the simple math of loyalty, that the son he'd raised would show up when it mattered. Mark didn't, and that choice, made poolside in Mexico with a drink in his hand, cost him everything he'd assumed was his by birthright. The inheritance wasn't stolen. It was transferred, quietly and legally, to the woman who sat by a hospital bed for 6 hours while strangers cut open her father's heart. The law calls that estate planning. The universe calls it balance. What happened to Joseph isn't rare. Elder abandonment in hospitals is rising, and not because families can't afford to show up, because they don't think they need to. They assume there will always be another visit, another chance, another surgery, until the day the monitor goes flat and the regret they've been postponing arrives with interest. Joseph survived. He got the second chapter most people never receive, a daughter who found him. Grandchildren who drew him get well cards, a letter from the woman who loved him enough to watch him from a distance but was too afraid to knock. Most people don't get that letter. They get a voicemail that's never returned, a holiday with an empty chair, a father buried by strangers because the son had somewhere else to be. If this story sits with you, it's because you know someone like Mark. Or maybe, if you're being honest, you've been someone like Mark. The good news is that phones still work. Hospital doors still open, and the people you love are still breathing, at least for now. Don't wait until the only family left is the one holding a clipboard. If this hit home, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below. Which part got you? The moment Sarah said dad, or the moment Mark realized he wasn't one anymore? I read every one, and trust me, your stories matter just as much as this one. Until next time, show up.